If you're wondering whether cannabis consumption and cannabis tourism is a going concern, you just need to scan the headlines. The Globe and Mail Canada writes, "Cannabis industry laments lack of progress towards allowing consumption spaces." The New York Times writes, "Connecticut legalizes recreational marijuana with sales aimed for 2022. Uruguay looks to bolster cannabis industry, allows tourists to buy marijuana," writes Bloomberg. A recent Forbes headline reads, "U.S. cannabis sales hit record $17.5 billion as Americans consume more marijuana than ever." On the less rosy side of the equation, we have Manitoba Premier wants to ban all public consumption of cannabis, from the Canadian Broadcasting Corp. ABC News notes, "Cannabis has been legal for almost 3 years, so why don't we want to get high off Ottawa's supply?" And Yahoo Finance adds, "Edibles are leading to more negative outcomes in cannabis users." In Europe, cannabis usage is at various stages of legality and decriminalization. This includes the Czech Republic, Portugal, Russia, Croatia, Spain, the Ukraine, and Switzerland. It remains illegal everywhere else in Europe. In the UK, it's a Class B drug and illegal for recreational use. In America and Canada, cannabis usage is either legal or considered a misdemeanor. South American countries are more accepting of marijuana, as many nations in this region have decriminalized cannabis possession, but sales and cultivation still remain illegal. So, as tourism professionals, what do we need to know about cannabis and cannabis tourism? Well, for answers to that and a Crash 101 course on cannabis, I turn to my friend Bryan Applegarth. Bryan is a leader and innovator in the cannabis tourism industry. He's the founder of the California Cannabis Tourism Association and a trusted advisor for destinations, brands, and hotels. In his recent work, Bryan partnered with MMGY Global, a leading tourism consultancy, to conduct groundbreaking research identifying and understanding the cannabis-motivated traveler segment in the United States. Hey Bryan, how are you? Where are you? What's it like?
Hey David, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. Appreciate the coverage on this topic. Really do. I'm in Sonoma County. I live in West Sonoma County in the Russian River, and just busy here with another busy week as the cannabis travel trend continues to grow.
Well, and I know you've been traveling because I've been on the road and I've seen you on the road. As you get back to work, there's a huge demand for not just what you're doing in terms of the services of your company, but in general, as we move into a greater understanding of this emerging segment.
Yeah, it's exciting as an industry. You know, cannabis and hemp as an industry in their own right that are unlocking globally. And then you look at the travel industry and the role of that in the global economy. And really the intersecting of these three industries is just a very exciting space to be. And there's so much opportunity. There's a lot of important discussions around safety and strategy and who is the audience and how do we reach them, and really how multi-layered is it? There's a lot of different types of cannabis-related travel strategies for destinations, hotels, brands, and beyond. So it's a very complex and very exciting conversation that deserves our attention, you know, today more than ever, as we have legal cannabis, you know, unfolding around the world.
Well, when I sit down and I get to talk to you, I'm always intrigued about your approach. I mean, if I could sum it up for our listeners, talking to Bryan for an hour is basically an opportunity to demystify what is cannabis, how is it being used internationally, what are the things we need to be aware of, where are the pitfalls and the like. A good place to start with that is to go back to the study you did with MMGY, though. Tell us a little bit about that study.
Sure, happy to. So I crossed paths with Peter Yesowich speaking at the American Hotel and Lodging Association conference in Michigan in I think that was 2018, 2017, somewhere in there. And that was what led to this collaborative study where I came in and worked with MMGY Travel Intelligence, and we built a survey that was deployed nationally. And the goal was to understand who the cannabis motivated travel audience is in the United States. And that information was collected in early 2020 prior to the pandemic. And what we learned is, of the leisure travel audience of the US, approximately 29% of that audience is motivated to make their travel decisions based on the ability to access a cannabis-related experience. So about 30%, right?
You're talking about 30% of the general traveling public.
So this would be 30% of the active leisure travel audience, which equates to 18% of all American adults.
That is a phenomenally large number. Surprising, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's exciting because it's the first study of its kind. It gives us the data that really starts spelling out who this audience is and what motivates their travel decisions, and also how they self-identify and self-describe. And you mentioned the word demystify earlier, and that's what a large part of this is just opening up discussion around who is the cannabis motivated traveler today and what are the different sub-audiences within that audience, because it's a very inclusive, very flexible, evolved plant that reaches into baby boomers and quality of life and replacing pharmaceuticals and whole plant wellness, as well as the young kind of new traveler that is, using it in a different way, the connoisseurs, the wellness travelers. So it opens up a big dialogue, especially when you start taking into consideration hemp as well as a renewable resource. And, not all the travel strategy revolves around the THC rich discussion. If you look at the cannabis travel trend on kind of an arc, there's only a sliver, there's only a kind of one piece of pie on that arc that really speaks to that THC rich, psychoactive component. And there's a lot of other discussions to be had.
So really, if I could paraphrase, it's not all about getting high.
It's not. No, it's not. It's about looking at a new opportunity. That's kind of a new paradigm. And, I'd spend a lot of time looking at case studies of hemp and cannabis as it existed around the world prior to 1937. We're less than 100 years into this illegal landscape. And if you go back and look at the role of hemp and cannabis without a stigmatized lens and start learning, it unlocks a really interesting, this journey for me has been fascinating in that way. I always loved travel. I come at this from a travel orientation. I studied international relations. I wanted to work for the UN. But when I reached into the cannabis travel trend and started focusing on this in 2015, I was familiar with the plant. But when you start learning about all the ways it can be used, it really is exciting to think about, wow, what a toolkit. How do we integrate this into the global travel ecosystem at the highest expression to deliver not just safety and education, but to really bring good into the world, make it more sustainable, make it more compassionate. Cannabis has that ability, and so does hemp. And it's there's a responsibility there, I believe, in the travel industry side, hotels, airports, and beyond, destinations and beyond, as well as the cannabis and hemp side, to make sure that this integration and the visitor experience when it comes to hemp and cannabis is very relatable, safe, accessible, a lot of education. There's a lot of amazing principles and ideas to depart on this platform that supports wellness.
So when you did your research on the cannabis motivated traveler segment, what other aha moments were in there for you? We were looking at an American market at the time, right?
Yeah. This is the United States market. Yeah, the national market, and this is in all kinds of different. At this time, there was less legal states, more, so it's shifted since because it's rapidly evolving as more states legalize adult use and recreational. So a couple aha moments were, I live in Sonoma County, which is typically known as wine and redwoods country. And there's a lot of debate here sometimes, and a lot of fear around cannabis and what that means for wine. And do we want these stoners up here and that kind of thing? So it was one of the aha moments that really resonated for me in my local community, is that the cannabis motivated travel audience actually skews higher as a wine enthusiast than the average active leisure traveler, almost nearly 10 points higher. So all of a sudden the conversation shifts from, Are these really competing industries, or are we serving the same traveler, and do we need to evolve? What does it mean for cannabis to become a precursor to a wine tasting, so you have that mouthfeel at a more sensory driven level? Or maybe, you even have cravings or a stimulated appetite to make the experience of the wine tasting or the Michelin star meal even more robust because cannabis was the precursor.
So you personally have done a lot of work on the idea of cannabis experiences and meals, but let's stay global for a second here.
Of course.
Prior to Canada's legalization of cannabis, the other quasi-legal experience, and I say quasi-legal because Amsterdam and Holland, it's not illegal to consume or to have cannabis, but it's still like, for example, I'm trying to think of an analogy where it's illegal to cultivate and sell it still. So it's a bit of a conundrum. But I would expect that when Canada legalized cannabis, that its implementation would look a lot like Amsterdam, and it didn't. It looked nothing like Amsterdam. It's not like that whatsoever, which kind of surprised me. As a tourism professional, it shouldn't, because one thing you learn about tourism is nothing ever happens the same in two different destinations. But when you look around the world and do the comparisons, I'm assuming the U.S. engagement of cannabis will look a lot more like Canadian, with dispensaries, with cannabis taking place in private homes to start with, especially as it follows on the heels of 2 decades of smoking being relegated to private residences. Is that how it's going to look?
Yeah, good question. This is part of that arc of legalization. If you look back at alcohol, when alcohol came out of prohibition, there's this stretch of years where there's all these growing pains, right? And this is one of those, because the way it manifests early on when it comes to retail and consumption, right? Like, those are the most consumer facing license types, where when a visitor shows up, where am I going to buy? Where can I consume? Those are the two questions. So you mentioned private, and out of the gate, as destinations legalize, when they don't have cannabis lounges yet, that is the solution, is for people to compliantly have a private space where adults 21 and up can gather and they can consume cannabis together. And that could, even in Sonoma County, I had a few events even prior to legalization where you go in and there's this kind of curated private event for adults where it's infused cuisine, or it's these things that are really glimpses into the future of where it's going to lead. And then it gets held up because there's obviously, and it's all warranted, but it takes a minute to get all the license types issued and make sure that safety has been thought through, and what are the mechanisms that are going to be rolled out to allow for this kind of consumption. And luckily in California, we're now at a place where there's a handful of licensed lounges throughout the state in different markets. So as we come out of this pandemic, the landscape of California specifically is going to really change, because there's cannabis lounges from Northern California down to Southern California. And it's an exciting new attraction for California to embrace, in my opinion.
Progressive places like California, like Toronto, embracing the idea of cannabis is one thing, but another part of their progressiveness is most of them have banned smoking in public places and seen it as a imposition on those who don't smoke. So it's a weird time to be evolving, marijuana use. But when I broached that question to you when we were in California at Cal Tourism, you pointed out to me that a lot of the work you're doing now has nothing to do with smoking cannabis.
Yep. Very true. Yeah. And that's one of the biggest educational demystification points, is getting people aware of cannabis 2.0 as it exists today. And there's so many types of methods of ingestion that are available. And not just that, there's also this complete range of dosing options with safe tested products, right? So you can really, when you go into a dispensary, or when you go into a retail shop or a lounge, you really have an option on that whole arc. And I usually equate this to like craft beer. You have non-alcoholic beer, and then you have 25+% alcohol. Cannabis now is the same way. You have 0 THC, or you have extremely high THC. But the beautiful part about legalization is you're seeing that whole middle area fill in, widening out that toolkit. So people can really consume cannabis in a way that is right for them and is controlled and is safe. And you have terms like microdosing that are getting more mainstream of what that means when you take cannabis. But to your point, that inhalation discussion, I constantly am making sense of that for people and being an educator in that space, because, there's topical, external application, and then there's internal ingestion, which is a whole nother level of, I guess I'd say risk, but it's something else to consider, right? Like applying something topically versus internal ingestion are two different kind of ingestion types. And then you have smoking versus vaping. And then you have the whole discussion around what they're finding. So what people need to understand is the biology behind cannabis. We have an endocannabinoid system internally in our body that is the master modulator of all of our other systems. I mean, people believe that cannabis now coming out today as a medical tool and a wellness application is the biggest thing since germology, really, because we have this dedicated system that without cannabis, even in the conversation, if we're just talking about a fully functioning human system, this system is operating daily, and we internally produce 2 cannabinoids that dock on these receptors. And the purpose of this system inside of all of our bodies is to bring our bodies into optimal balance, into homeostasis. So when you take the cannabis plant, it flushes that system and it docks on those receptors, and it puts phytocannabinoids into your body instead of endocannabinoids, which we produce. So we synergistically evolved with this plant, and this plant, biologically, we have a system that directly communicates with the therapeutic properties of cannabis. And this is why cannabis is inherently at its core a tool for wellness and balance and homeostasis and holistic health.
So that's the discussion. That's the discussion you're having almost with everybody when I hear you talk.
Yep.
Let's distill it down to tourism. You spend a lot of time talking in the tourism space, and again, you were at the Cal Tourism Summit to talk about cannabis. I promised a kind of 101 on cannabis. Where do we get started at destinations? I mean, there's destinations in the world that have cannabis. There's destinations where it's coming. There's places where it'll be there in the next year or two. Where do you start in all of this as a destination organization, figuring out what your role and function is, and do you have a role and function, and do you have a stake in this? Where do you suggest to our peers out there that we start on this?
I mean, I'm a big believer that data-driven education. So everything from the report, the study that MMGY and Cultivar Strategies did together, case studies of what's happening in the most progressive trend-setting markets like Greater Palm Springs, visit West Hollywood, visit Mendocino. How are they approaching this with actual coordinated plans at this point? But where you get started is really bringing the conversation current through data and case studies. And also at that same time, it reduces stigma. So it allows for actual meaningful dialogue to happen where you can talk through a non-stigmatized lens and start creating a plan around what is possible today. Another great first step, if your market's a little further along, like if you're in an adult use market and you just haven't taken a leadership role yet and you're a destination or a DMO, another great place to start is to start assessing what is in your destination as far as cannabis assets, and especially cannabis assets that really understand what it means to be part of the travel industry and that serve the visitor economy, are walking distance from hotels, people that are constantly coming in. What is the plan? And what are the cannabis assets there? And who are the hotels that are serving these guests? Because that's where this travel trend is really existing in some ways right now, today.
In that schema, do brands and hotels work with law enforcement in the long run? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, as needed. I think it's market by market. I mean, I work with 5 destinations currently in California doing holistic, coordinated cannabis strategy from arrival to departure and what that means. And sometimes it involves meeting with elected officials and stakeholders and the mayor and law enforcement. It really just depends on the destination DNA and who the stakeholders are and where they're at in the conversation. As far as I'm concerned, the more education, the better for people to really understand what this is. And also something that comes along with that, David, is, it goes into this kind of destination lens of destination development. Absolutely travel, absolutely the visitor economy. That's a vital part of all of this. And that's where I live and breathe and my teams live and breathe. But cannabis is a powerful industry that is rapidly growing, that has a lot of upside coming, and the projections are through the roof, whether it's cannabis, CBD, or hemp. So looking at this as a destination, what is your destination brand? Like this came up for one of my destination clients, is like we naturally crossed paths about, well, what is the cannabis narrative out of this? Like, what is the industry? What is the messaging that the cannabis industry in its own right? What are the sweet spots that are the differentiator that's going to empower cannabis industry growth in a meaningful way in your destination? And then how does that dovetail into that consumer facing kind of travel experience narrative? And how can those work synergistically from like an industry in a destination to the travel trend strategy that's woven into the visitor economy outreach, and driving visitation?
Walk us through some of that comprehensive, immersive cannabis travel strategy type thing. I mean, you can go to West Hollywood, you can buy pot, or I think that's a destination you are working with. You can go and there's a number of experiences that you're working on that are quite high end, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea is, to evolve that kind of craft, a little more sophisticated, evolved, curated really cannabis experience, because now we're in an illegal market where you can actually curate it and you can have collaborative strategy between a luxury hotel, the DMO, as well as signature brands that are locally crafted or created or grown. And that can be all tied up with a bow as an amazing experience from A to Z. And there's probably a great foodie experience in there as well, right?
Well, so, ask you, is there a luxury hotel out there that's doing curated cannabis experiences? You don't have to name any names, but is there one?
Yeah, there's a couple that are now and that are continually evolving toward that, because in these destinations, people are buying cannabis and bringing it back to their hotel anyway. It's like, what do you do? Stick your head in the sand and pretend it doesn't exist? Or do you have a plan and start speaking to what's legal in your destination, what people are actually doing and visitors are doing? So absolutely, there's a handful of luxury hotels that are very excited about this. They're already offering programming and solutions around it that are very normalized in their guest experience. And there's rapid kind of innovation happening at the same time.
Will they actually evolve spaces? Because right now my experience is, if you walk through the Mondrian Hotel in LA in 1999, somewhere you'd smell pot. If you walked through it in 2021, same thing, but it's not apparent or visible or anything. It's just still happening. So I don't see the beginning of that yet.
Yeah, it's been kind of a light touch up to now with like CBD massages, and there's been some customized delivery service as an amenity strategies that I've supported with, and but I believe that 2022 is going to be a banner year for seeing kind of the next evolution of cannabis and hemp integration into the visitor experience or the hotel guest experience. I think this is going to come in the form of activations where it's part of the programming on site, where you have just like a happy hour for alcohol. You'll have some kind of gathering for cannabis that speaks to the cannabis culture. And that's part of the magic here, is being able to harness, that edutainment, and what does that mean for people that show up to a hotel where it needs to exist within the hotel culture in a really brand aligned way, just like the destination. And what are all the considerations that come around that? And there are a handful of considerations, right? From inhalation to non-inhalation. A lot of times when I've worked with hotels in California here over the last 5 years, we lean into a non-inhalation microdosing model. So you can avoid the and I saw these pain points in real time because I was lucky enough to be where I am, to be at the front of it. And I saw I heard those stories from the hotel owners of like, man, I had 2 ambulance trips this month. Somebody was given, they went to a dispensary, they were given 20 milligram edibles, and they had to cancel their dinner plans that they've been waiting to, they've been wanting to do that for a year now. And so it's when you start seeing these negative impacts on the experience because of a lack of coordination and a lack of planning, that's where that's the first step of that opportunity that you talk about, is like, what should destinations be doing now? You should be, if you're an adult use market, we should be acknowledging that that's a thing, and create kind of, get the education and case studies and create a safety plan to make sure that not only you're protecting guests and you're giving them good information when they ask where they can get it and where they can use it, but you're also protecting your staff. I saw the negative impacts on hospitality staff as well, whether it's not knowing how to recommend a dispensary or a delivery, or perhaps recommending one that who knows if they're licensed or not, because there's been no due diligence. There's a lot of unlicensed operators out there today, because technology is where it's at. Cannabis is newly coming out of an illegal kind of market landscape, so there's still people that are out there vending. So, having the kind of safety protocols for your guests as well as your staff. One of the staff ones that was interesting that I remember hearing was, they had their housekeeper cleaning the rooms, and, they eat the edible. They ate a chocolate because there was a chocolate laying out, and they were cleaning the room, and lo and behold, it was THC. So 3 doors down, the house, the staff member falls asleep on the bed because. So it's impacts on both sides. Yeah.
Sure. So we are seeing a growing sophistication. In Canada, some of our biggest shingle law firms have created cannabis divisions. I mean, you're dealing with an industry that's pushing well above the hundreds of millions into the billions here already. Guess what? That warrants entire legal divisions. We're seeing a lot of consultancies up here, very credible consulting firms, 3-letter, 4-letter names that that are in the space. Are you seeing the same kind of evolution down there? Is it happening already? Are law firms involved? Are consulting companies? I mean, MMGY participating in the study is a groundbreaking piece.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, that mainstream, we all know how amazing MMGY is as a leader in the travel industry, and the insights and data and the strategy. So having them, take a leadership position on this with data and bringing Cultivar in and myself in was a big deal, right? That moves the needle at a global scale, in my opinion, when you have that kind of data being pushed out by someone like an MMGY. And we've seen others come on board, big cannabis companies too, that are publicly traded, multi-billion-dollar companies today, are looking closely at travel and what does this mean for us and how do we best serve our audiences. So you're seeing it from the travel industry side and the cannabis industry side, and hemp is coming right along with it. So yet again, I always see this intersection of 3 massively powerful industries. The projections for the United States is over 90 billion by 2026. In California right now, the recent 12-month cycle, approximately 4 billion in sales, more than 800 million in state taxes, and approximately 300 million in local taxes. And there's over 100,000 jobs throughout the state that are part of the cannabis industry. So, it's rapidly growing. It's projected for more growth. And I am seeing a lot of kind of mergers and acquisitions happening right now. It's definitely continuing to follow that legal track, which is, that track of eventually this kind of activity and consolidation. And I think the beautiful part about this that I'm excited about is this is really opening up and going into this era of travel, right? So the last 5 years, I mean, some of my education started with, you could hear a pin drop and you ask who uses cannabis and no one raises their hand. Whereas today, there's really trend setting destinations like Visit West Hollywood and Greater Palm Springs that are creating a plan, like a really holistic plan. And we're really honored to be supporting them with that. So we've come a long way since I started in this space in 2014, 2015.
So we started demystifying cannabis travel for those of us in the industry, and we've sort of gone full circle. We're talking about the necessity to make sure that we're constantly demystifying for the traveler so that they understand what it is, so that they have a better experience. As we wrap this one up, any closing words, first of all, for our travel management peers?
I just think education and data is vital. If you're a destination, the audience exists. They're already moving about. They're a high value audience. If you look at the median household incomes, it's an affluent audience. And this is going to be a trend that continues to grow. So regardless of kind of stigma or sentiment, and I know that there's a lot that still has to unlock. And I know there's that federal in the United States, the federal legalization question mark that kind of hangs in the balance, right? But it's rapidly growing, and I I would encourage everybody to look into this. It's probably more than meets the eye. There's a lot of different types of ways to integrate cannabis and hemp into your strategy, and it's not necessarily smoking. It's not necessarily THC or mind-altering substances, psychoactive substances. There's a lot of ways to start preparing for this, as well as activating on it to evolve.
And to that 30% of the active traveling American public, any words of advice or direction to them?
I mean, just as exciting. It keeps evolving. The cannabis appellations of California are starting to unlock next year, just like wine. We're going to have microclimates and conversations around terroir and what kind of cultivars grow great on this slope of Humboldt versus this slope of Mendocino. Versus down in Santa Barbara, and that's happening in other places. I know in Canada, there's farm to gate, which is kind of this other really special element to the Canadian landscape. And you got Jamaica opening up resorts of all kinds where you have buds on your pillow and it's integrated. And if you're a traveler looking for these kind of experiences, we're exciting. I think a lot of destinations are excited to welcome these visitors that are excited about experiencing cannabis, whether it's a place of source, just like wine grapes and vineyards, or whether it's something a little more sensory driven, like a West Hollywood, cannabis lounge coupled with an amazing, art experience or live performance. So it's going to be very exciting. Cannabis, with that THC element, gets into this targeted sensory enhancement. And what is cannabis as a precursor to the set and setting or the activity you're walking into? And how can it amplify the experience, whether it's making food more flavorful or music sound sweeter? So I wouldn't shy away from opening up discussions around that too, because cannabis and the effects of cannabis are extremely different than alcohol. And though we like to compare it as a controlled substance, the way that this is going to activate and evolve and travel is through highly curated experiences that have elevated sensory targeting for set and settings that you're walking into. But before you get there, there's a whole bunch of other things we can discuss as well, if that's a little bit progressive. So,
well, I thank you for the progressive talk today. It's always fascinating to talk to you, Brian. I can't wait to check back in literally 12 months out and see what 22 looked like in the cannabis industry, because I think you're right. It's poised for meteoric growth. It's happening as fast as we can talk about it. Thanks for being here. It's a real pleasure, as always.